Well, good morning, everybody. It's about 9:30 in the morning, and I'm recording this second of our emergency online classes. I've got my coffee, and I'm ready to go. Hopefully, you are too. Um, so, what we're going to talk about in this lesson is the first few presidents and some of the challenges that they faced as they helped to create what's going to become our modern republic. Because remember, these guys, it's all brand new to them, right? We have the advantage nowadays that we can look back at people like Washington and Jefferson and Adams and all of these guys and say that's how presidents should behave. Well, these men didn't have that. They didn't know exactly how the government branches were going to mesh together. If this design that they created in the Constitutional Convention was going to work as smoothly as they had hoped that it would. Um, and so they've got to figure all of this stuff out. They've got to get everything set up, and it's a lot to handle. But these men, thankfully, were up to the task. Hopefully, most of you already know that George Washington was the first president of the United States under the United States Constitution, which had just been ratified in 1789. They hold elections, he wins, and will be the first president from 1789 until 1797. We're going to talk just a little bit about him before he became president, but mostly what we're going to discuss is all the challenges he faced as president. Here we have two different portraits of Washington. The one on the left, Charles Wilson Peale painted this in 1772. He's painted as a younger man in the uniform he would have worn as a member of the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. And it's the earliest authenticated. We absolutely know that this was a painting of George Washington in a portrait. In other words, that he was actually physically there when the painting was done as an adult. On the right is one by Gilbert Stuart, painted in 1795 while Washington was president. And you can see that he's aged quite a bit. It's only been 23 years, but the experiences of the war and everything, and as president, because he'd been president for 6 years at this time, had aged him somewhat. Now the white hair kind of throws you off. If you'll notice, his eyebrows are sort of a reddish brown. That was the color of his hair naturally, but of course at the time it was common for wealthy men to powder their hair or to wear a powdered wig as a way of showing off their wealth. Someone who could keep their hair powdered and clean and neat like that obviously did not work on a farm or in some sort of a manual labor kind of job because you wouldn't be able to keep it that way. So just a little bit about him personally. Most of us have probably heard stories about Washington's life. When I was a little boy, they used to tell the story about it, how he chopped down a cherry tree one day, and when his father came out to ask him about it, he said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I who chopped down the cherry tree." That's an allegory, okay? That didn't actually happen. He was born in 1732. His family was wealthy and prominent, planter family. They'd been around for several generations at this point, and had made a good deal of money in land speculation. As a young man, Washington went to the island of Barbados in the West Indies with his half-brother who was suffering from tuberculosis, thinking that the changing climate would be helpful to the brother. It turned out it didn't really help him. And Washington caught smallpox while he was there. This is believed to be one of a possible reason why Washington never had any children of his own, and he didn't, unfortunately. Um, At the age of 26, he married a wealthy young widow who was a couple of years older than he was. She was only 28, but she was just a tiny bit older than he was, named Martha Custis, who already had two children from her prior marriage. He would adopt them. Um, their marriage was believed to have been happy. They stayed together. He was very affectionate with her. When her daughter passed away, she had an epileptic seizure and died. When her daughter died fairly young, not too long after they were married, he basically spent most of his time for 3 months, really, comforting Martha. And so he was very affectionate towards his wife. Physically speaking, he was taller than most men. He had a very sort of dignified and regal bearing. He was said to have been actually a bit intimidating. He was apparently enormously physically strong, like famously so, and was known for being an excellent horseman. He liked to ride horses. He went fox hunting and things like that, a common pursuit amongst the wealthy at the time. Um, his public demeanor was reserved and formal, and that's pretty much true most of his life. But when amongst friends and family, he was known for being a happy and sort of jovial person. Not a clown, but he would tell jokes and dance and sort of relax a good bit. He did have false teeth. He suffered from tooth decay his entire life. Again, that might be contributable to the smallpox that he contracted as a young man, but it could also just be bad luck. Um, he had numerous sets of false teeth throughout his life, and eventually he lost all but one of his teeth. He did not have wooden teeth. That's a myth. Uh, Probably because he did have a set of teeth that had been presented to him that were made from ebony, which is wooden. It is a kind of wood, but he never actually used them. False teeth at the time were usually made from one of a couple of substances, either the tusks of certain animals like elephant tusk ivory or walrus ivory, or other real human teeth. It was not uncommon for people to take the teeth out of the dead, set them into dentures, and create sets of false teeth. Kind of gross, but true. Washington was a slave owner. He was from the South. He was wealthy. He was a slave owner, and he purchased slaves throughout his life. He inherited his first 10 to 12 when his father passed, and he got to his first farm. But as time went by, he grew to despise slavery, and he actually called it repugnant in a letter to his private secretary when he ordered him to try to figure out some way to take care of his slaves after he passed in his later years. Um, in his will, he freed the slaves, 160 slaves that he owned. Of the slaves that he was sort of in charge of, though, many were tied up in a dowry that really made them Martha's property, and he legally couldn't give them away. Dowries were really sort of strange, legally binding things. The idea was to ensure that a widow would be provided for, and it meant that the husband could not sell off her dowered property, including slaves. When Martha died, more of the slaves were freed as well. But he did free most of his slaves. He also made sure that provisions were made to take care of the young and the elderly that were freed, that could not work, to take care of any illnesses that they may have for the rest of their lives. He made sure that the young were educated and even apprenticed into good trades. And so he did his best to make personal amends for what he thought was an institution that was not good by the time he had aged. He also saw it as definitely a source of division and a potential real issue for our nation. Unfortunately, he didn't have an answer for how to resolve it. Washington would die in his home at Mount Vernon at the age of in 1799 at the age of 67. When he died of epiglottitis officially, basically a swelling of his epiglottis, uh, basically throat cancer. Um, he was eulogized by an American Revolutionary War officer who had served under his command in the Continental Army as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And that's pretty well how people felt about him. I mean, Washington was a beloved figure, pretty much throughout the country. Even his political rivals had little bad to say about him personally. The man who did that eulogy was, his nickname is Light Horse Harry, but it's Henry Lee, who is actually Robert E. Lee of the Civil War's daddy. So he's a relatively famous figure as well. So the very first elections under the Constitution are held in really held in 1789, but we call it the election of 1788 because of the 4-year gaps. George Washington wins the presidency unanimously. He got the majority of the electoral votes of each and every state. He is sworn in on April 30th of 1789 in New York City, which was the capital of the United States at the time. The United States had 3 capitals: New York City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. John Adams received the second highest number of electoral votes. Adams was from Massachusetts. Washington was from Virginia, if you didn't know that. And so because he got the second highest number of electoral votes, he became vice president. That was how vice presidents were chosen at the time, the second highest number of votes. In Washington's first term, he's got a lot of things he's got to do. He's got to set up the federal court system. He's got to implement Hamilton's financial plan for the nation, as he chooses Hamilton to lead our finances. And he has to be the model for all presidents to come. And he does that, right? I mentioned earlier that he had a very sort of dignified, the term is gravitas, the sort of sense of dignity and solemnity and seriousness about the man. And he sets this for all presidents to follow, and most presidents have done their best to follow it. And the reason for that is, as the head of a brand new state, which is a republic and is not been around and doesn't have the same traditions that other major nations of the world had. And remember, we're not a major nation at this time, guys. We're just kind of this little frontier country out on the backside of beyond, just getting our feet underneath us. We're nothing like a world power by any stretch of the imagination. But as the head of state, Washington is still expected, it's part of his job, to deal with the ambassadors, the dignitaries, the leaders of other nations. And so he's got to be taken seriously, right? This new job of president, he's trying to set the tone that this is a serious job. This is not just a popularity contest. This is the leader of a serious nation who must be taken seriously. And he does a very good job of setting that tone. And again, like I said, most presidents since then have followed along in that sort of model. So they're setting up all of the different branches of government. They're just getting started under the Constitution. And one of the branches, of course, is the executive branch. The head of the executive branch is the President of the United States. He is the chief executive. It's part of his titles. He sets up the executive branch at first with 3 departments, really, and then an attorney general. The first department was known as the Department of Foreign Affairs, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now it's known as the Department of State, and the first leader of that, they call them secretaries, is Thomas Jefferson. The Ministry of Finance, later the Department of the Treasury, is headed up by Alexander Hamilton, who's famous nowadays and popular because of his very not terribly historically accurate, but quite entertaining musical Hamilton. The Secretary of War, the Minister of War, now of course Department of Defense, we don't call it Department of War anymore, was Henry Knox. Knox had been a Civil War officer, or pardon me, not Civil War, American Revolutionary War officer in charge of the artillery, the cannons, under Washington, and so that's why he chose Knox to be the head of the Department of Defense. And as Attorney General for the United States, he chose Edmund Randolph. Now, at the time, there wasn't really a Department of Justice. There was simply an attorney who represented the United States government. There was not enough going on at the time that really he needed more than one guy and his staff, his direct staff, you know, the paralegals and things like that. This is known as the first cabinet, the group of the president's highest level advisors. Now, cabinet members have to receive the approval of the Senate to serve. Still true, that's part of the Constitution. It says that the Senate has the right to approve the highest level dignitaries and ministers and such, and that's who these guys are. They are appointed by the president. However, he chooses who he wants. The Senate then is expected to look at this person's qualifications and say, yes, they are qualified to do the job. He's not just giving an important job to his idiot cousin Clem because Clem needs a job. That's what the Senate's job is to do when a president makes a cabinet appointment. But although they have to have the president's appointment and the Senate's approval, they serve at the president's pleasure, which means he can fire them at any time or ask them to resign. And that happens quite a bit. They get used as scapegoats pretty often. Sometimes people ask, why is it called the cabinet? At the time, and still technically, I suppose, but at the time, the term cabinet was sort of like saying private office. You would be cabineted in your private office, sort of like a cabin on a ship is your sort of private space. That's what they meant by it. It wasn't like a piece of furniture. It's not like they all hid out in a small piece of furniture or anything silly like that. So another big problem that the nation is facing is that the United States is not just broke, but they're in serious debt. And Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, it's his job to figure out how to fix all this and to set the country up on a good, solid financial footing. And so he outlines a bold national policy based on three concepts: public credit, a national bank, and aid to manufacturing. And he wants to create sort of a public commonwealth system where the government assists economic development in order to then profit from the proceeds in the form of taxes from that. Okay. So Hamilton planned to use public credit to buy off the debts of the government. And he's got to do this at face value. In other words, if you had an IOU, a promissory note from the old Articles of Confederation government, say you had sold food to the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and they had paid you in scrip, which was basically an IOU. And you had sold it for $100. Now, that scrip had been being used and traded at a much lower value. That $100 scrip, you may have sold that to somebody for $10 in gold. And those people were speculating that one day that $100 of scrip might be worth more than $10 in gold. And so what Hamilton does is he says, yes, we're going to buy that back. We're going to basically make loans out to people that are interest-bearing securities. These are called bonds. And when we get cash in for that, we are going to buy back that scrip at face value. This is going to improve the nation's credit. It's also going to tie wealthy creditors, the people who loan the money to the United States government when they buy those bonds, to the success of the country. See, if the country fails, then they lose that investment. And so it's sort of a clever way of making sure that the wealthy don't start sending their money overseas anywhere and investing it overseas. They now have an interest in keeping this country going. He also proposed that the national government should assume the states' war debts, not just the national war debts, but each of the individual states' war debts. Uh, and that doesn't go over quite as well because although the states would love to not have to pay them off, it also gives the national government sort of a handle on the states, some leverage on them, and they didn't like that idea. As part of the deal to get this public credit law passed, however, they're going to agree to site the new national capital that they're looking to build. Everybody was interested in having a city built specifically to be our capital. We're going to build it in the south, and they locate it on the Potomac River, which sits between, which is the border between Virginia and Maryland, both of which are southern states, and that's where Washington, D.C. is now. The National Bank is an idea that he creates to help provide stability to the U.S. economy. They get a charter from the government that's basically a contract with the government for 20 years. And this is the first bank of the United States. We'll have another one later on. And basically what it does is it provides loans. It's where the United States government places all of its money, which the bank then uses to make loans, just like regular banks do, and collects interest on them. And the U.S. government profits somewhat from that interest. Manufacturing aid was the third part of it. And what he wants to do, what Hamilton wants to do, is create a system of tariffs to raise money for the government. This is going to ease tax pressure on domestic industries, and it's going to provide some income, some revenue. So these are what are called revenue tariffs, not protective tariffs. Protective tariffs are much higher than a revenue tariff. And this is going to help to improve trade with other nations because we're not imposing protective tariffs. Everybody understands that you're going to have to pay a little bit of an import tax when you bring stuff from another country into a new country. Okay, it's just one of the ways countries make cash. Pretty much has been that way for a very long time, and still is. But if you put in protective tariffs, those are those really high tariff rates where you see things double or triple in price sometimes even. That cuts down on trade, right? That's the whole point of it, is that you're trying to convince people to buy the locally, domestically produced item rather than the foreign produced item. To buy a Cadillac rather than a Mercedes, for example. And the problem with that is that slows down trade between the countries, right? So if you're buying Cadillacs instead of Mercedes, that means Germany is not selling as many Mercedes here. Well, typically what happens is the other country will respond with a protective tariff of their own, and that kind of reduces trade. What we're looking to do at that time was to increase the amount of trade we had. We needed to export goods so that we could get cash coming into our country. That was very important. And so Hamilton wants to set things up to do that. Okay, here we are back to setting things up. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which is signed by Washington in September of that year, creates the first federal court system and establishes the very first Supreme Court. At the time, they had 6 justices. There's a problem with there being an even number of justices. If anybody can think of what that is, try to think about why that would be an issue. Washington's going to appoint John Jay, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, I hope you recall, as Chief Justice. So he's the very first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's his portrait, his official portrait, painted by Gilbert Stuart. Gilbert Stuart, by the way, was a very prominent portrait artist at the time. You'll see a lot of his paintings around. And this one hangs in the National Gallery now. Creates 13 judicial districts, one for each state, except for Virginia and Massachusetts, which each got 1. or pardon me, each got an extra one. They got two. At the time, North Carolina and Rhode Island were not yet states. They had not signed the Constitution yet. They had not ratified the Constitution. So they don't have all the rights and privileges of a regular state. And so this is the creation of our first federal court system. Moving along, we get 4 years goes by. Washington's been very busy setting up the national government, the executive branch, and filling the spots in the judicial branch, and all of these things. Election of 1792 comes along. Washington runs again, and he wins again. It's a landslide for him. It's unanimous. He's the only president, by the way, ever elected unanimously. He's going to have to deal with some foreign issues. The French Revolution is going on at this time. It begins in 1793. Declares that the United States will be neutral in this, even though a lot of Americans supported the ideas of the early French Revolution, because it was, they were setting up a republic, and we had close ties with the French from their allies. They were allies with us during the American Revolution. But that was the king of France, not these revolutionaries. Now, some of the revolutionaries had supported America. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had come over here as a young man and had fought in our revolution, was a revolutionary leader in the early days of the French Revolution. He sided with them, not with the king, because he believed in creating a more just society. He ends up not getting what he wanted, but that's beside the fact and outside the scope of the course. Now, the French Revolution also leads to wars all across Europe, particularly between the British and the French. We're still not friendly with British. We trade with them, but we don't really like Britain, and they're kind of not real happy with us either. But we declare ourselves to be neutral in all of this and continue to trade with all nations. They've got money, we've got stuff, and vice versa. At the end of this second term, Washington is going to choose not to run again. He's getting tired. He's getting older. Although he's by no means an old man yet. He's getting older, and he's fought 2 wars, and he's just getting a little tired of it. He chooses not to run again. And part of it is he's, again, setting precedents for the people who will follow him up. And most other presidents have kept with this tradition at the time. It's now law, but at the time it was tradition. Just before he leaves office, Washington gives what is arguably his most famous speech, the only one we're really going to discuss. It's known as the farewell address. And in this, he makes 2 really important points. One of them is, he says, do not form divisive political parties, which he sees happening. Okay, the government and the politicians in America had started really to form political parties. He says, guys, don't do this. It's just going to be a source of division rather than unity. We need to be a United States. And unfortunately, of course, you see the first party system spring up as soon as this election, the elections of 1796 roll around. That gets ignored pretty quickly, and as you know, has continued ever since. The other thing that he argues against is getting entangled in the affairs of other nations. He says, avoid foreign entanglements, such as getting involved in the revolution over in France, or taking sides in the wars between the French and the British and the Germans and the Russians and all. He says, stay out of that, because we got no business getting into all of that. He says, we are not, that is their issue, their problem. We can't get involved. It will end us. And he was right. At the time, it would have been just absolutely destructive. And that's something that we do continue to do and have continued up until really World War II. And we pretty much end that after World War II. Since then, we've been pretty much involved in everybody's affairs. And so here we go with the very first party system, the birth of political parties. It's called the first party system because it's the first pair of parties, and we've had several. We'll talk about them as they come up, as each party system comes up. The very first political parties debated several issues, but one of the biggest was, what role does the Constitution play? How should we look at the Constitution's role in controlling things in America? One party, the Federalists, believed that the Constitution should be very loosely interpreted. Sometimes it's called loose construction. And you may see it referred to as that. So understand that that's the same as loosely interpreted. What that means, it's a very teenage way of looking at it. Anything that's not expressly forbidden by it is allowed. So I know that many of us have recently been teenagers, some of us not so recently, but we recall it. Imagine that your parents are going to be leaving town, and they say, before they leave town, they tell you as a high school student, you are absolutely forbidden to take our car out. You may not drive our car. Just stay with your car. You know, maybe they've got a really nice car. Maybe the parents got a really nice car, and they just don't want you to wreck it or whatever. And you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, I will not drive your car. Parents leave. First thing you do is call up your best friend, give them the keys, and let them drive. Because they didn't say your best friend couldn't drive the car. They said you couldn't drive it. Okay? That's kind of how the Federalists look at the Constitution. If it doesn't expressly say you may not do this, then it's okay, you can do it. The goal of the Federalists is to strengthen the power of the central government. Okay? They want the central national government to have more authority, more powerful, by making it more capable of adapting to changing events, and by making it where it can just kind of do what they need to. And part of the Constitution that allows this to a degree is known as the Elastic Clause. And it says essentially that Congress has the power to make laws proper and necessary as they come up, okay, as issues come up. Important members of the Federalist Party are John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, for example, wanted to create that Bank of the United States. Well, the Constitution doesn't say anything about whether or not you can create a Bank of the United States. And so the Federalists, like Hamilton, said, see, it doesn't say I can't do it, so certainly the government can do this. Right? The other party is known as the Democratic Republicans, although often they were just called the Republicans, and strangely enough, they will eventually morph into being the Democrats. Yeah, that's not confusing at all, I understand. That used to confuse the bejesus out of me too. So the Democratic Republicans believe that the Constitution should be very strictly interpreted. And that's kind of the opposite of the Federalists. To the Democratic Republicans, anything not expressly permitted by the Constitution was forbidden to the national government. So unless the Constitution specifically says you can do this, then it was not up to the federal government to do that. So let's stick with the Bank of the United States. Democratic Republicans didn't believe that was legitimate. Okay. They said that the central government is not allowed to do that because there is nowhere in the Constitution that it says that they can. Okay. The goal of the Democratic Republicans is to prevent the growth of power of the central government. These are the people who had started off as anti-federalists mostly because they feared too strong of a central government. Remember, just finished a war just a few years before, 1783, when the peace treaty was signed. This is only, a decade or so later, and they're looking at not wanting to have a powerful central government like the British had had that can sort of push around everybody else, the states and the local governments and the people themselves. So that's what their goal is. They're trying to keep the national government small and contained, and leave more power to the states to deal with issues more locally and with a little bit more flexibility between one location and another. Some of the important members, some of the leaders of the Democratic Republicans in the early days are going to be Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. All right, so the election of 1796 rolls around. Washington has bowed out. This was going to be the first truly contested election. It's also the first one with active political parties. And essentially, it boils down to you've got a choice of one of two people: John Adams, who is the Federalist primary candidate, and Thomas Jefferson, who is the Democratic Republican primary candidate. They don't have a ticket system yet. That'll come later. We'll discuss that as it comes up. But that's how it was. There were other Federalists that ran. There were other Democratic Republicans that ran. But these are the two guys that are in the front runners the whole time through. John Adams, who is the Federalist candidate, gets the most electoral votes and therefore becomes President of the United States, which I often abbreviate as POTUS, P-O-T-U-S. By the way, I also often abbreviate Supreme Court of the United States as SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, rather than writing out the whole thing. Thomas Jefferson, who is the Democratic Republican candidate, gets the second most votes and therefore, as the Constitution requires, becomes vice president. Does anybody see a problem with that system? If something were to happen to John Adams, the Federalist president, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, would become president. It's one of the only jobs the vice president has under the Constitution, is to basically be there in case something happens to the president. His other job is to be the presiding officer of the Senate, where he can vote if there's a tie. This is so much of a problem that it's going to have to be addressed by a constitutional amendment in 1804, and we'll talk about that more later. Adams gets saddled with a few crises. One of them has to do with the French as part of the Revolution and part of their ongoing wars. There's a lot of shenanigans going on over there in France. And one of the things that happens is known as the XYZ affair. The French foreign minister, we send some American diplomats over to France. The problem is that French ships are stopping and seizing American merchant vessels heading to Britain. The British are doing the same to American vessels going to France. We don't like that. We're a neutral nation. They're not supposed to be interfering with us trading with other countries. So we send some diplomats over to talk to the French about it because they're at least still technically our allies. And the French foreign minister, whose job it is to meet with us, not only refuses to meet with them personally, he sends 3 agents who get nicknamed X, Y, and Z. He sends 3 agents to meet with our diplomat, and he says, you have to loan France a large sum of money, and you have to pay me a bribe personally, or I'm not going to bother to meet with you. When word of this gets back to the United States, it infuriates the U.S. government and the U.S. people. We cut trade with France. We authorize privateers, these basically legalized pirates, to attack French shipping. We have, in essence, an undeclared maritime war, a naval war with France. It's not technically a declared war, so it's not really one of our wars. But it's a pretty serious crisis. The French were our best friends as far as major nations go, and that's pretty much wrecked by this. It's very difficult, very damaging. The other big thing that happens is that the Federalists are going to pass 3 laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the idea of this is to silence their critics from the other party. Now, that's not legal. Okay, First Amendment says you can't do this. And so they're going to be partly thrown out. Okay, but they do pass 3 laws. The first is the Naturalization Act, which increases residency requirements to become a citizen from 7 to 15 years. That's going to keep new citizens from supporting the Democratic Republicans, which, by the way, tended to do. The Alien Act authorized deportation of foreigners that the government decided for one reason or another were undesirable without trial. The government could simply say, we don't like you and get rid of you. Again, this is trying to silence critics, many of whom were recently come to the United States and supported the Democratic Republican Party, not the Federalists. And the last is the Sedition Act, which is absolutely unconstitutional as well. Violating the First Amendment, it says you cannot publish attacks on the president or members of Congress. That is obviously a very clear violation of the freedom of the press, which says that you can, in fact, say that the president is a bum, if that's what you think, or Congress is full of a bunch of idiots, if that's what you think. Now, you can't say threats against them. That's a different thing. But you can express displeasure with them and their policies and how they're acting in their performance of their jobs. That is absolutely a protected right. What these do, besides getting thrown out eventually by the Supreme Court, is it sparks the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These are two states, Virginia and Kentucky, pass these resolutions within their states, which say that states have a right to judge the legitimacy of national laws, whether or not they're going to follow the Naturalization Act, the Alien Act, or the Sedition Act, and enforce them locally in their own states. This is the birth of a concept known as states' rights, and it's going to be a long-term issue. This is the start of a struggle between the states and the national government. You may have noticed that I'm putting in the terms at the bottom of these, 1801 to 1809, for example. Jefferson's going to be first elected in 1800. He doesn't actually take office until 1801, and he doesn't leave office until 1809 because the inaugurations are not held in the same year as the election. So that's why those numbers won't match up. In the election of 1800, we get a problem. It's the first time we have an electoral problem and a constitutional crisis as a result of it. The main candidates are John Adams as a Federalist. He's the incumbent. He's running for re-election. Thomas Jefferson, the former vice president, or the current vice president at the time, who's a Democratic Republican, and Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr was actually running to be vice president. He didn't expect to beat Thomas Jefferson. But Jefferson and Burr tie in the electoral votes, and Adams comes in third. And the reason for that is each elector at the time cast 2 votes. And it was supposed to be essentially one for president, one for vice president. But if they vote for a party, right, if they're, say, members of the Democratic Republican Party, they cast 1 vote for Thomas Jefferson and 1 vote for Aaron Burr. And that's why they get the same number of votes. Adams comes in third because he gets the Federalist votes, and there were fewer Federalist electors than Democratic Republicans. So we have a tie. Nobody has a majority. Now what? It's not that it goes to the person who has the most. The Constitution says a majority. And if there's not a majority, and a majority is more than half, that's the definition of a majority. If you've got 100 people voting, you must have 51 votes, not 50. Half is not a majority. 51 votes. If you have the most but not a majority, that's called a plurality, by the way. Anyway, so the Constitution says if there is no majority, then the House of Representatives will vote to select amongst the top 3 vote-receiving candidates. And so that's what they do. And the House votes, and there's no clear winner. And everybody goes around and starts cutting deals, and they vote again, and no clear winner, and again, and again, and again. And each time the votes shift a little bit one way or the other, but never to a majority. And the House is going to vote 35 times for this. Eventually, Jefferson will win. And he wins because Alexander Hamilton, who is a prominent Federalist, sways Federalist congressmen to support Jefferson instead of Burr. And the reason he does that is because Adams is losing votes each time they hold a vote. Okay, every time they vote, Adams is slipping further and further back. It's obvious Adams is not going to win. So basically, Hamilton says, Federalist buddies, we have a choice, Jefferson or Burr. We're going to get one or the other eventually. Vote for Jefferson. And he says that partially because Hamilton and Burr personally despise one another. Okay, so Jefferson will become president of the United States. Burr will become vice president. And one of these days, Hamilton and Burr are going to fight a duel over their personal and political animosities, a duel in which Aaron Burr, vice president of the United States, will shoot and kill Alexander Hamilton, former minister of the Treasury, i.e., Secretary of the Treasury, and probably future president. If Hamilton had not been shot and killed, he probably would have eventually won the presidency. The big question here is Adams going to abide by the rules? Adams is in charge of the army. It's not a big army. We don't have a large army, but what army there is, he's in charge of. There's never been a turnover of power in a contested election in the United States history at this point. And so the question is, will Adams do it? And of course he does. Adams is a huge believer in law and order. It's why back in the day, John Adams had defended the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre. Not because he liked the British, not because he thought they were innocent, but because the law says that they're entitled to a strong defense. No one else would take the case. He said, well, I have to take it. Somebody has to defend these people. It's the law. And he's always been a big proponent of, this is the law, we follow it. So he does relinquish his authority peacefully. This is sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800, because this was a different way of changing leadership. And so now we enter into an era known as the Jeffersonian era, Jeffersonian democracy. Jefferson believed that the ideal republic would be made up of small farmers who owned their own land, private landowning farmers, and that manufacturing would only be done by craftsmen in their shops. He was, he saw that the Industrial Revolution was starting in other parts of the world. He really didn't want any part of that. His goal was that American farms would trade profitably for European manufactured goods. He believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He even says that the government that governs least governs best. And to show that, he repeals all the internal taxes, any excise taxes and things like that. He does keep tariffs. He does keep tariffs on goods imported. He reduces the size of the army even further. As small as our army was, he makes it smaller. He basically puts the Navy in mothballs. Not entirely, but darn near. And he's going to reduce the national debt. He works very hard towards paying off our national debt, making us more independent of wealthy bankers and such. Like most people, however, he's not 100% consistent with these things. And the biggest example of that is the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. There's no explicit constitutional authority for the president to purchase territory. Nowhere does it say that. It does say that the president has the right to negotiate treaties with the Senate approving them. That's one of the powers of the Senate under the Constitution and one of the powers of the president. So it's legal, but it's not really explicitly stated. And so this is not, the purchase is not a consistent move for him. So why does he do it? Land. Farmers have to have it. He wants a bunch of farmers. Farmers need land. It was a huge, great deal. Under Jefferson, the United States will fight its very first foreign war. It's an often forgotten conflict called the War of the Barbary Pirates. North African pirates had menaced ships in the Mediterranean for decades. That's actually more like centuries. Most countries simply paid the rulers of those nations basically a bribe to not permit the pirates to attack their ships. When the United States ceased to be British, we lost that protection. Jefferson then refused to pay the tribute and instead chose to build up the Navy and attack the pirate state of Tripoli, which had started preying on U.S. vessels. The Navy and the United States Marine Forces land at Tripoli, defeat the local forces, force a treaty with them to protect U.S. ships without us paying tribute. At first, it does not go well for us. The pirates actually capture one of our ships, one of our warships, and take it into Tripoli. We then send a raiding party in to recapture the ship. Unable to do so, we burn it. We destroy it ourselves in order that they can't use it against us. It's a relatively small conflict between two small nations, but it is, like I said, our very first foreign war. We are successful in it, and the Marines have never forgotten it. It's in the first lines of the Marine hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our country's battles on the land and in the sea. And that's what they mean by the shores of Tripoli. It doesn't really end the problem until a decade or so later, when we've built up our forces a little bit more and we go over and kind of kick their teeth in another time. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. I've mentioned before that there's just a few years that I'm really going to kind of key in on that you need to remember as sort of turning points. 1492, 1776, 1787. This is another one of them. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson bought Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte for $15 million. Originally, we had asked to just buy the city of New Orleans because it controls the exit to the Mississippi River. And we were using the Mississippi River to send produce from places like Ohio and Kentucky out to the ocean and then shipping them off to the rest of the world. And we wanted to control that because the city controls that access. Well, Bonaparte needs cash to fight another war against Britain, and he'd really like to not have to deal with any of all of that territory, and really New Orleans is the only thing of major value there. So he says, I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. We'll just sell you the whole thing for $15 million. Now, at that time, $15 million was a huge amount of money, massive amount of money. But even so, it's only about 3 cents an acre back then. In modern terms, we're talking less than a couple of $100 an acre. I would love to find land that's that cheap. This instantly and peacefully doubles the size of the United States. And it's important because this is where we begin our process of westward expansion, which is going to continue all the way through the 1800s as we move further and further west. Okay. Most of the territory that we purchased was uncharted wilderness. We now own the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. We also claim that it gives us title to land across the Rockies through what's now Oregon, Idaho, Washington State, through that stretch. Probably technically it really didn't, but we go and explore it, and so that's why we claim it. Most of the territory was uncharted wilderness at the time. Thomas Jefferson is going to send an expedition to go and find out what it is that he had just purchased. And it's led by two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Officially, it's called the Corps of Discovery. Everybody refers to it as the Lewis and Clark expedition. They go from St. Louis, Missouri, all the way out to the Pacific and back. It takes them a couple of years, actually, to do that. They discovered a lot of things. They discovered dozens of Indian tribes. They send examples of hundreds of animals and plants back. It's a very dangerous journey. They're traveling a long way through unknown territory. They're crossing mountains. They've got a winter over the twice during this time period. They have to stop and hang out for the winter because travel during the winter would have been fatal. There's wild animals. There's unfriendly natives. They get help from a young Indian woman named Sacagawea. It's a pretty famous story. I'm sure most of you have heard it before. Sacagawea was married to a French trapper. She was a young girl, probably about 16 or 17 years old, and she had a baby with her, the son of this trapper. And she spoke French. Lewis and Clark both spoke French. They could speak to the trapper could speak to her. She learned English over time, but and she also spoke several of the local native languages, and so she acted as an interpreter. Another really important thing that she did for them, and this is something that people overlook a lot, is that her presence there a young woman carrying an infant child with her and being sort of in the lead, because when they came across other natives, they would send her out kind of to talk to them as a peaceful gesture. Well, it is a peaceful gesture. War parties that might be raiding from one place to another, they certainly didn't bring along women and infants, right? A group of 40 or so men who nobody knew and were strangers and didn't speak any language that anybody could speak. That was a threat and would have been met probably at some point at least with violence, right? Um, this young lady with her baby is no threat. So she would go and speak with the locals, um, and it kept them from having to fight their way across, and it was life saving. There's no two ways about it. It probably would have been impossible for them to have completed the journey had she not gone with them. So she's pretty important. Sacagawea is, and throughout all of this travel and everything, I mean, they travel 1,000 miles each way, actually a couple thousand miles each way. They draw maps, they do all of these things. Through all of it, there is exactly one fatality. Only one person dies. And of all things, what happens to the poor guy is he gets appendicitis, his appendix bursts, and he dies of a septic shock infections, blood poisoning essentially from the burst appendix. And he's buried along the way. And everybody else made it. You know, I mean, they run into grizzly bears and rattlesnakes and forest fires and just all kinds of things. And it's the appendix that gets one of them. All right, this is the first Supreme Court case we're going to discuss. There are some other kind of important ones during this time period, during this Jeffersonian era, but this is the first one I want to discuss specifically, and it's Marbury versus Madison. And the case comes before the Supreme Court in 1803. Chief Justice at the time is a fellow by the name of John Marshall. John Jay has retired. Actually, I think he's died by this point. Marshall is a Federalist appointee. Remember, these jobs are for life, or until you decide you don't want to do it anymore. But Marshall was appointed by Adams, and he and Jefferson are going to clash over differing interpretations of the Constitution several times. And the case comes before the court, like I said, in 1803. The details aren't terribly important. Essentially, Marbury loses. What is important about the case is that it establishes the court's authority to review congressional legislation and executive actions. And basically, this is what truly establishes the principle of judicial review. And that's the court's biggest power as far as checks and balances are concerned. And so this is a very important case. So 1804 rolls around. We have another election. Aaron Burr does not run alongside Jefferson. They have not been really friendly since the previous election when Burr tried to become president. And so Jefferson is going to face a fellow by the name of Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, whoops him pretty easily. In this term of office, biggest problem Jefferson's going to have to face is the effects of the war between Britain and France that are still going on. I mean, Britain and France are at war for basically 20 years during this time period. They start in 1793. They don't end up until about 1815. And for the most part, they're at war the whole time. And how Jefferson is going to deal with this is by passing the Embargo Act of 1807. These wars have spilled over once again, just like during the XYZ affair, and started to affect U.S. shipping. Both nations are stopping and boarding American ships. The Royal Navy is even pressing sailors off of U.S. ships. If they were formerly British subjects and had become Americans, the British are saying basically, you don't get to be an American. You're still British. We need sailors for our Navy. Welcome to the Navy. And they do it. Their warship will pull up to an American merchant ship. The American merchant ship is going to stop because a warship will kick their butts. It's just not even a question of it. So the American ship stops. They send over sailors and Marines, and they just start grabbing people. And if you resist, they shoot you. We almost go to war with Britain over this issue. when a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Leopard, fires into the USS Chesapeake, and as part of pressing some sailors. Jefferson doesn't want a war. He knows we can't afford it. As much as he hates the British, and Jefferson did not like the British at all, uh, he knows we really aren't ready for a war with them and wants to avoid it. And so his move is an embargo. He's going to put in trade restrictions, just like during the American Revolution when we had boycotted British goods. Unfortunately, he overestimates the importance of U.S. trade to these countries. And he gets a law passed, the Embargo Act of 1807, which says basically U.S. ships can't leave the United States. You can go up and down the coast and trade between one state and another, but you cannot go to any other country. This is crippling to the U.S. economy. And neither Britain nor France were much bothered. And because of the damage it's doing to our economy, it's very unpopular. And we have here a political cartoon about it. This cursed "Oh grab me," which is embargo spelled backwards, and how they're trying to trade with a British ship there. It's saying that it's really going to stop them, and it really didn't. All right, the election of 1808 starts to roll around, and Jefferson declines to run again. He's following the precedent set by Washington. Washington had served 2 terms. Jefferson only serves 2 terms. Adams lost his second term. He didn't get a second term. James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State, same fellow who helped write the Constitution, the Virginia Plan, and all that good stuff, is elected president. One thing Madison inherits from Jefferson is the problems between the United States, England, and France. England and France are still fighting again. This is going to lead to the declaration of war against Britain in 1812. And the causes for that are that the British are still pressing American sailors. The British, through Canada, have been giving guns to the Indians in the West to keep us occupied, basically. We're having to deal with threats to our frontier. And so that keeps us from allying with the French, who we were more likely to ally with than the British. The British had been supposed to surrender certain forts out in the West to us, and they never did. They refused to do that. And honestly, we want to push the British out of Canada because, for one thing, they're causing trouble with us on our frontiers. But secondly, we want the land. The United States would just like to have that land and claim it for ourselves. It's not a popular war. The Federalist New England, who does a lot of business with Britain, are very opposed to it. They're just starting to get back on their feet after the Embargo Act had been thrown out, and so they're pretty opposed to the war. The Westerners, the people of the West at this time, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, that region along the Mississippi River, kind of, they're all for it, and the South is somewhat torn, but more in favor than against. The people of New England are so strongly opposed that several of the states actually send delegates to a convention held in Hartford, Connecticut, called the Hartford Convention. And one of the things that's actually mentioned at this is, I mean, they're discussing what are we going to do about this war that's looming. They say, well, maybe we should secede and form our own country, and then those guys can go to war with England, but we don't have to. And so the idea of secession comes up there in New England for the first time, not down in the South. So we declare war on the British in 1812. That's when the War of 1812 begins. The War of 1812 begins in 1812. If you were to see a test question that asks, in what year did the War of 1812 begin? That's not a trick question. Hint, hint. That is not a trick question. The War of 1812 began in 1812. The United States declares war on Britain. It was really not a smart move. We're still a very small country. Britain is one of the most powerful nations, one of the wealthiest, well, probably the wealthiest nation in the world at the time. It was just a bad idea. Overall, the war goes pretty badly for us, especially when it comes to being on land. We try to invade Canada, and we go into their capital even, which was in a city called York at the time. It's now called Toronto. And we burn their Capitol building. And then the British troops show up and chase us off, and we lose a lot of people, fairly heavy losses. This is under the command, by the way, of a fellow by the name of General Winfield Scott, and his name's going to pop up time and time again. He will be a general in the United States Army for a very long time, over 50 years. So uh, he tries to invade Canada. It goes pretty darn badly. British troops in return will land outside of Baltimore and march to Washington, D.C., which is very near Baltimore. The U.S. forces scatter in front of them, and they come into Washington, D.C., and burn our public buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. The president's wife, Dolly Madison, is known for having saved many of the presidential portraits and sort of the gifts that other nations had sent to the United States as sort of diplomatic gestures. She actually saved a lot of those things, and virtually the wagons with these, like the presidential china and portrait of Washington and things like that, are sneaking out the back with Dolly Madison alongside as the British troops are coming in the front of the White House. And you know, they would not have hurt Mrs. Madison probably. Soldiers back then were kind of rough, but they would have known she was a woman of quality. They probably would have left her alone. Their blood was not really up high. They hadn't really had to fight much to get into the city or anything, so they probably wouldn't have hurt her. But it was still kind of a risky thing for her to stick back and do that. So she was a pretty brave lady. Her husband and of course the government had to leave Washington as the enemy troops approached to avoid being captured. You don't want your government to be captured by an enemy during a war. Before they could land at Baltimore, the British had to subdue a fort in the harbor called Fort McHenry. And they do that by bombarding it. And they bombard it all day and all night from some ships, firing cannons and rockets and all of these sorts of things at the fort. And one of the people that witnesses this is an American lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key, who's aboard one of the British ships trying to convince the British to let one of their prisoners go. And so he watches this overnight, and he's inspired to write a poem about it, which is known as the Star-Spangled Banner, which many years later will be set to music and will become our national anthem. Our Navy did surprisingly well, especially considering how small it was. We didn't have any of the big ships. Big ships at the time were called ships of the line, and we didn't have any of those. We did have a smaller category of warship called frigates. And for frigates, our ships were very large and very tough. They were brand new, relatively speaking. They were modern, and we had good sailors and commanders. And whenever they fought just one-on-one against British frigates, we did surprisingly well. We won several of them. Probably the most famous of these battles is the duel between USS Constitution and HMS Guerriere. The Constitution was so solidly built that the Guerriere's smaller cannon could not penetrate the sides of the ship. And these are just wooden ships, right? They're not made of steel or iron or armor plate or anything like that. And so the Constitution, because Guerriere's cannonballs literally bounced off the side in some cases, gets nicknamed Old Ironsides. Constitution, by the way, is the oldest ship in commission in the world. She is still technically part of the United States Navy, is an official vessel of the United States Navy, and she is moored in Boston Harbor. One of these days, I really need to go to Boston because I really want to get aboard her. So while we don't do great in the war, we do okay at the peace table. And that's largely because the British never really wanted this war. They were kind of half-hearted about fighting it the whole time. They were much more worried about the British, I'm sorry, the French. They defeated Napoleon, turned their full attention on us, and said, look, you really don't want this. And we agreed, okay, fine. We'll just kind of go back to the way things were before the war. And that's essentially what happens. And I say we win the peace because had the British gone ahead and pressed this, they would have taken us back over. I mean, that was the kind of thing people did back in those days. Was if you won a war, you took territory away from the guy who lost. Very typical thing to happen back in those days. And to the British, to a lot of the British, we were still rebels. They had not reconciled themselves really to the fact that we were a separate nation. It had only been, 36 years, I guess, 26 years since we had declared independence, and 36 years, and less than 30 years since the end of the American Revolution. They weren't, and I mean, a lot of these politicians were like, well, we remember when you were one of ours. The King of England was still George III. He was still king. And although he was on and off crazy, he remembered when we belonged to him, and he would have liked to have had us back. Interestingly, the treaty is signed on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814, in the city of Ghent in Belgium, and so it's called the Treaty of Ghent. Interestingly, our biggest land victory is fought in the Battle of New Orleans, and I'll put a link up to a fun little song about it, just for fun, but you should watch it. Watch the little video. The battle was fought in January 1815, after the war had ended. But the important thing is that word had not arrived yet to America that they had signed a peace treaty, because it was only a couple of weeks later, and there was a big lag in communications, right? I mean, the fastest way to get a message across was put it on a boat, and that took a few weeks. And so we just had not heard that the war was over when we fought this final battle of it. So what comes out of the War of 1812? Well, we come out relatively unscathed. Again, like I said a moment ago, if we had lost, we probably would have ceased to exist as a nation. So, it's a good thing. We do get an increase in international prestige. I mean, we stood up to the British, one of the most powerful countries in the world, and weren't instantly humiliated. So that makes us look good. It led to fame for a couple of future presidents from their military careers here. Andrew Jackson, who had commanded at the Battle of New Orleans, our biggest victory in the whole war, and a fellow by the name of William Henry Harrison, who fought in the Battle of Tippecanoe against native allies of the British, mainly. And so he became famous for that. And the result of our winning this war, and again, it's sort of a political win or a diplomatic win, not necessarily a military win, but it helps to spur something known as the era of good feelings. So 1812 is an election year. And while Federalists had opposed what they called Mr. Madison's War, that's going to hurt them in the polls in 1812, because by and large it was popular in the West and in the South. And the apparent U.S. victory in the war will help end them once and for all when the election of 1816 rolls around. And Madison wins the election of 1812 with substantial support from those war hawks from the West, people who had supported the war from these new Western states. In his second term, Madison is going to do a couple of things. He's going to approve the Second Bank of the United States. The First Bank's charter is running out, so he's going to have to recharter it, and he does that. But he also vetoes legislation to spend money funding roads and other internal improvements. That doesn't make him terribly popular with the West, who wants those things to help connect them to the rest of the country. And we're going to call it for the day here. We need to continue reading chapter 7. If you haven't finished it, please do. And be sure to keep an eye out for a quiz. It'll be coming up either with this or with the next section over chapter 7. And with that, I hope you have a good day. Stay healthy, and we'll talk to you again soon.